They thought he was just another easy target, a quiet man, sitting alone in a roadside diner, minding his own business. But assumptions can be dangerous, and some battles are lost before they even begin. The late afternoon wind had a bite to it as Darius pulled his truck into the gravel lot of Earl's Diner, a tired-looking joint that had seen better days. It sat just off Route 66, its neon sign flickering weakly against the overcast sky. A place like this had its own rhythm, one where time stretched long, and unfamiliar faces weren't always welcome. Darius cut the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor. He wasn't in a hurry. He rarely was. Adjusting his cap, he grabbed his wallet and stepped out, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. A lone gas station stood nearby, its rusted pumps long abandoned. It was the kind of place where the world slowed down, where people kept to themselves, usually. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and fried food. The black and white checkered floor was worn, and the booths, though sturdy, had their seams splitting from years of use. A jukebox sat in the corner, silent, its glory days long past. A few patrons scattered across the diner lifted their heads at the sound of the door jingling. Some glanced his way, then returned to their meals. Others let their gazes linger, their expressions unreadable. But Darius was used to that. He moved with steady ease, heading for a booth near the window, positioning himself so he could see the door. Old habits. He slid in, resting his hands on the cracked formica table, scanning the menu more out of courtesy than necessity. A waitress approached, notepad in hand. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old either. Just someone who had seen enough of life to know when trouble was brewing. Her pen tapped against the paper as she glanced toward a group of men in the corner. Bikers, by the look of them. Leather vests, dark sunglasses, and an air of ownership over the space they occupied. They weren't speaking now. They were watching. "What can I get you?" Her voice was even, but there was something else underneath. A nervous edge. She wasn't worried about his order. She was worried about them. Darius didn't react to the weight of their stares. He'd felt that kind of attention before. It didn't concern him. He kept his voice calm, quiet. "Cheeseburger fries. Coffee black." She nodded, scribbling it down. "Be right out." He could feel their eyes still on him as she walked away. Conversations had resumed, but in hushed tones, like a storm was gathering just outside the door. The leader of the group, a broad man with tattooed knuckles and a thick beard, leaned back in his chair, making a point to be heard. "Well, would you look at that? Seems we got ourselves a tourist." The others chuckled, the kind of laughter that wasn't meant to be friendly. It was testing the waters, seeing if they could get a rise out of him. Darius ignored it, lifting his coffee cup and taking a slow sip. He'd learned long ago that silence could be louder than words. It unsettled people. It made them fill the space with their own noise. The air in the diner shifted, tension curling through it like smoke from an unseen fire. The waitress returned, setting his coffee down with a slightly unsteady hand. He met her gaze and gave her a small nod, silent assurance that he was fine. She left quickly. The bearded man wasn't satisfied. "Hey, buddy, you deaf? Or just rude?" His voice was sharper now, carrying an edge of expectation. The other patrons had stopped pretending to eat. They were watching, waiting. Darius lowered his cup, resting it lightly against the saucer. He didn't look at them, not yet. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. The situation was escalating, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Before we get into what happened next, let me ask you, how would you handle a situation like this? Walk away? Confront them? Or stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. The tension in the diner thickened like a slow-moving storm, the kind that creeps in before anyone realizes just how strong it will hit. Darius remained still, his hand resting lightly on his coffee cup, the heat barely registering. He had been in far worse situations than this. Far more dangerous men had tried to rattle him. These bikers? They didn't realize the mistake they were making. The wiry man with stringy hair smirked, shifting in his seat. "Maybe he's lost," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Ain't much for his kind out here." The low murmur of conversation in the diner faded. The fork scraping against plates slowed. Eyes flicked between Darius and the bikers, waiting, anticipating. The waitress behind the counter shifted her weight uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot in her hand. Darius didn't acknowledge her concern, nor did he acknowledge the growing stares of the other patrons. He simply took another sip of coffee, calm, deliberate, as if the insult had never been spoken. The quiet unsettled them. They expected a reaction, something they could latch on to. But Darius gave them nothing. Travis, the broad-shouldered biker with a thick beard and tattooed knuckles, pushed back from his seat. The chair legs screeched against the worn linoleum floor as he stood, boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. His stance, the set of his shoulders, the way he rolled his head from side to side, it was all an act, a performance designed to intimidate. He wanted to make it clear that he ran this place. That strangers, especially ones like Darius, didn't get to just walk in and ignore him. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the booth. "Hey boy, I'm talking to you." The insult hit the air like a slap. A challenge, thrown out with the expectation that it would shake something loose in the man before him. Darius, finally, set his cup down, the ceramic clinking softly against the saucer. Then he lifted his gaze, meeting Travis's eyes without an ounce of hesitation. "Something I can help you with?" His voice was smooth, steady. Not indifferent, but not aggressive either. Just a simple question, stripped of emotion, carrying an undertone of patience that made Travis hesitate. Just for a second. That stillness, that calm, it wasn't the response he had expected, and something about it set off a flicker of doubt in the biker's eyes. He had been in plenty of fights, had scared plenty of men into submission, but there was something different about this one, something he couldn't quite place. The hesitation was brief, too brief for anyone else to notice. Travis clenched his jaw and took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Yeah, you can help me. You can pick yourself up and walk out of here." Darius didn't move. He let the silence settle between them, thick and heavy. He had no interest in unnecessary fights, no need to prove himself. He had spent years learning how to let people underestimate him, how to let them think they had the upper hand, until they didn't. The waitress exhaled shakily from behind the counter, her fingers twitching toward the phone. She knew she should step in, but she also knew it wouldn't help. The cook, who had stopped mid-motion with a spatula in his hand, watched, his expression unreadable. One of the bikers chuckled low under his breath. "He don't talk much, does he? Maybe he's scared." Travis grinned, encouraged by the remark. He leaned in closer, planting both hands on the table, his knuckles inches from Darius's plate. "That it? You scared?" Darius finally moved. Not much, just enough to shift his weight slightly, to glance at the hands on his table. He wasn't scared, but he was patient. He had given them every opportunity to let this go. The waitress took a step forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe just let him eat his meal? Huh. No harm in that." Travis didn't even glance her way. His focus was locked on Darius, on the way he refused to play along. And that refusal gnawed at him, chipped away at his pride. He had started something, and now, in front of his crew, he had to finish it. His voice dropped to something almost mocking. "I don't think you get how things work around here." Darius exhaled softly, measured. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on him. He could feel the shift in the air, the thickening of the moment, the inevitability of what was coming next. "I get how things work just fine." Travis's jaw tightened. "That's so. Then you should know this ain't your place." Darius slowly, deliberately, lifted his coffee cup once more, took a sip, placed it down just as gently as before. Then finally he looked Travis directly in the eyes. "You sure about that?" It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. Easy, steady, like he had already decided how this was going to end. Like he had seen this exact moment play out 1,000 times before and knew exactly where it was headed. Travis took another step back, just slightly, barely noticeable. But the others saw it, and that was enough. His pride wouldn't let him back down. The confrontation was inevitable. Travis's fist hit the table with a dull thud, causing the salt shaker to jump and spin before toppling over. A hush fell over the diner, the kind that only came when a line had been crossed. The other patrons shifted in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others too intrigued to look away. "I don't think you heard me, friend," Travis said, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. Darius remained still, his expression unreadable. He inhaled slowly, the only acknowledgement of the moment. He had seen this play out before, too many times to count. He knew exactly how it would go. Travis grinned, a smug, satisfied smirk that lacked any real confidence. He turned to his crew. "Get up, boys." The scrape of metal chairs against the floor filled the silence as 5 men rose in near unison, surrounding the booth in a loose semicircle. Their movements were lazy, almost rehearsed, like men who were used to having their way in situations like this. Darius let out a quiet sigh and finally placed his coffee cup down with deliberate care, his fingers resting lightly on the rim. He wasn't tense. He wasn't flustered. The only thing that shifted was the air in the room, a silent change only a few could sense. The waitress took an uneasy step back, gripping the edge of the counter. She knew there was nothing she could say that would de-escalate this. The cook had disappeared into the kitchen, unwilling to involve himself. A man in the farthest booth, someone old enough to know better, sighed and shook his head. Travis cracked his knuckles. The others shuffled forward, eager, expectant. They thought they were in control. They had no idea. Darius's eyes flicked over the group. Loud, reckless, sloppy. The kind of men who mistook numbers for power. The kind who had never truly tested themselves. "You sure you want to do this?" Darius finally spoke, his voice level calm. No fear. No hesitation. Just a simple, genuine question. Travis's grin faltered for just a fraction of a second before he masked it with bravado. "Yeah, I'm sure." Darius nodded, almost to himself. "All right then." And then he moved, not in anger, not in haste, but with precision, like a man who had rehearsed every possibility 1,000 times before. The first man reached for him, fingers curling toward his collar. Darius was already ahead of him. A subtle shift of weight, a controlled grip, and the biker's own momentum was used against him. In an instant, he was flipped onto the table, knocking over plates and sending a half-finished cup of coffee spilling onto the floor. The second lunged blindly, fists swinging wild. Darius sidestepped with ease, planting a firm elbow into his ribs before guiding him downward, where he crumpled with a pained grunt. A chair scraped. Another came at him from the side, thinking he had the advantage. Darius ducked, sweeping the man's legs out from under him with a calculated kick. He hit the ground hard, the breath leaving his body in a sharp exhale. 3 down. The remaining 2 hesitated. Travis, still standing, looked at his fallen crew, his expression shifting from amusement to something closer to disbelief. Darius straightened, adjusting his jacket, his breathing steady. "You still sure?" Travis's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who backed down easily, not with an audience watching. He rushed forward. It was desperate, uncoordinated, a last-ditch effort to salvage whatever pride he had left. Darius didn't step back. He met him head-on, shifting slightly to the side at the last second. A swift movement, a grab, a pivot, and Travis's own force sent him crashing into the booth where Darius had been sitting just moments before. Silence. The entire diner was still, the tension now replaced with something else. Travis groaned, struggling to push himself up, his breath coming in short gasps. The others remained where they had fallen, too stunned or winded to move. Darius exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "It's over." His voice wasn't mocking, wasn't taunting. Just a simple statement of fact. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, one of the bikers stumbled to his feet, glancing toward the door. He hesitated, then made his choice. Without a word, he turned and walked out. One by one, the others followed, each stealing glances at Darius, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Travis remained where he was, head down, fists clenched. But even he knew when he was beaten. Finally, with a defeated grunt, he shoved himself upright and staggered after them. The door swung shut behind them. The diner exhaled. The waitress, still gripping the counter, released a shaky breath. The old man in the booth chuckled under his breath. Darius picked up his coffee cup, He swirled the liquid inside, debating whether to take another sip. Instead, he set it down again and reached for his wallet. He placed a few bills on the table and slid out of the booth. As he walked toward the door, the waitress found her voice. "You all right?" Darius paused, turning back to her with a small nod. "Yeah, I'm fine." Then he pushed open the door and stepped outside, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint scent of burnt coffee. The first punch never landed. Travis lunged forward, his fist cutting through the air, but Darius moved like water, stepping just out of reach. His movements were effortless, controlled. Before Travis even registered the miss, Darius caught his wrist in a firm grip, twisted it behind his back, and forced him onto the table. The impact rattled the dishes, sending a half-empty glass of water tumbling over. A sharp gasp escaped the waitress's lips. The other patrons remained frozen, their wide eyes bouncing between the bikers and the man who had just turned the tide of the confrontation with unsettling ease. The other bikers hesitated. It was the first crack in their confidence. Darius released Travis, who slumped forward with a groan. He didn't need to look up to know the others were still sizing him up. He had been in enough situations to know what came next. The pack mentality wouldn't allow them to back down just yet. One of the bikers snarled, rushing toward him with a wild swing. A sloppy move. Darius shifted his weight and stepped inside the strike, an elbow snapping up into the man's ribs. The biker gasped, stumbling backward, the air driven from his lungs. Darius didn't give him a chance to recover. With a calculated shove, he sent the man sprawling into an empty booth, the wood groaning under the sudden weight. Another came at him from the left, faster than the last, fists clenched and determined. Darius caught his arm mid-swing, twisting it outward and using the man's own momentum to drive him face-first into the counter. A dull thud echoed through the diner, followed by a clatter of utensils and a muffled curse from the cook in the kitchen. 3 down. The last 2 men shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering. The silence between them was thick, filled only with the heavy breathing of their fallen comrades and the faint hum of the flickering diner lights. Darius stood unmoving, his breathing steady, his expression unchanged. He hadn't broken a sweat. One of the remaining bikers clenched his jaw, steeling himself, but Darius could already see the hesitation in his stance. He didn't want to be next. The leader, Travis, pushed himself upright, his movements sluggish. He wiped a hand across his mouth, glancing down at the streak of blood on his fingers. He looked at Darius, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, just confusion. "You," he started, but the words failed him. Darius tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You done?" His voice was calm, devoid of challenge. It was a simple question, but one that carried undeniable weight. The last biker took a step back, his hands shaking. Then, as if a silent signal had been given, he turned and bolted for the door. The bell above it jangled wildly as he shoved it open and disappeared into the night. Travis watched him go, his shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. He turned his gaze back to Darius, but there was nothing left to say. He knew it was over. Slowly, he staggered toward the exit, dragging his wounded pride with him. The remaining bikers followed suit, limping and cursing under their breath. One paused near the door, as if considering another attempt, but after a glance at Darius, he thought better of it. Then silence. The diner, once thick with tension, was now eerily still. The waitress still stood behind the counter, her hands gripping it so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The cook peeked out from the kitchen, a spatula still clutched in his hand, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. Darius exhaled, adjusting his sleeves. He glanced down at his untouched coffee, then slid a few bills onto the table before standing up. The waitress finally found her voice. "Sir, you all right?" Darius offered her a small nod. "Yeah." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. He stepped outside into the cool night air, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The sky was a deep, endless black, the neon glow of the diner casting long shadows across the lot. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that inside, the story of what had just happened would be told over and over again. But for him, It was just another night. Another fight that never should have happened. Another lesson taught the hard way. And just like that, he was gone. The waitress stood behind the counter, her hand still hovering over the phone, fingers clenched tightly around the receiver. She had been moments away from dialing, from calling someone, anyone, but now all she could do was stare. The cook, his apron stained with grease and flour, peered out from the kitchen window, his spatula frozen mid-air, as if the moment had turned him to stone. The hum of the overhead lights buzzed, filling the quiet that had settled over the diner like a thick fog. Travis groaned, shifting his weight, his body stiff and aching as he struggled to push himself up from where he had landed. His face, once smug and full of arrogance, was twisted with disbelief. His hands pressed against the floor, his breath coming out in short, uneven bursts. He looked up, his gaze locking on Darius, and for the first time, there was no challenge in his eyes. Only confusion. Only the slow, dawning realization that he had underestimated the man before him in ways he couldn't even comprehend. "Who the hell? Who are you?" he managed, his voice hoarse, laced with the remnants of a pride he could barely hold on to. Darius looked at him for a long moment, his expression calm, unreadable. Then, with a quiet shrug, he replied, "Just a guy getting lunch." The weight of those words settled over the diner, lingering in the air like an unspoken warning. Darius didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or revel in what had just happened. He simply stood there, as composed as he had been from the moment he walked in, as if none of it had ever mattered. The remaining bikers, the ones still conscious enough to move, exchanged uneasy glances before averting their eyes. One of them, still gripping his side where he had been hit, took a slow, hesitant step back. Then another. No one said a word. No one dared. Travis, defeated, let his head drop. He didn't try to push himself up again. Not yet. Not when his body still trembled from the shock of it all. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the pain coursing through his limbs or the effortless way Darius had handled him and his men, as if they had never been a threat at all. The waitress swallowed hard, finally finding the courage to lower the phone. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a nearby cloth, a nervous habit more than anything else. She wiped at the counter, though there was nothing there to clean, her eyes flicking toward Darius as if seeing him in a new light. The man who had walked into the diner that afternoon was no ordinary stranger. That much was clear. And yet, he didn't ask for attention. He didn't demand recognition. He simply turned, slipping his wallet from his pocket and pulling out a few bills, which he placed neatly on the table. A tip. Nothing more, nothing less. Then he adjusted his cap, gave a polite nod to the waitress, and made his way toward the door. His boots echoed against the worn linoleum, the only sound in the room apart from the shallow breathing of the men who had tried to take him on. As he reached the door, the old man sitting at the far end of the diner, the one who had been silently observing the entire ordeal, finally spoke. His voice was low, scratchy but certain. "I had never seen anything like that before." Darius paused, his hand resting lightly against the doorframe. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. "Hope you don't have to again," he said simply, before stepping outside into the fading light of the evening. The door swung shut behind him, the small bell above it jingling softly. The waitress exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest, as if releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The cook finally blinked, lowering his spatula. The diner was never the same after that day. People whispered about the stranger who walked in alone and left behind a lesson no one would forget. They spoke of the quiet man who never raised his voice, never lost his composure, but who had dismantled 6 men as if they were nothing more than reckless boys playing a game they never should have started. They never saw him again, but the story of what happened that night lived on. A reminder that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one you should never test. Strength isn't about intimidation. It isn't about throwing the first punch or proving yourself to the loudest voice in the room. Real strength is something quieter, something steadier. It's control, composure, the ability to stand firm when it matters without needing to make noise. Darius didn't need to fight. He never did. He had walked into that diner expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, just another stop on a long road he had traveled many times before. But the world doesn't always let a man be. Sometimes it tests him, pushes him, crosses a line. And when it did, Darius met it, not with anger, not with ego, but with precision, with restraint. He could have ended it quickly, could have broken bones, could have left them with wounds that would take weeks to heal. But that wasn't the lesson they needed. Pain fades, embarrassment lingers. And for men like Travis and his crew, the realization that they had been dismantled with such ease, without rage, without desperation, was a lesson they wouldn't forget. Long after the bruises faded, long after the ache in their ribs eased, they would remember how it felt to be powerless in the face of a man who never once raised his voice, who never once lost control. That was the part that would stick with them. That was the part they would carry. The waitress, the cook, the old man in the back of the diner, they would remember too. Not just what happened, but how it happened. How a single man, with nothing more than calm certainty, had taken apart 6 others without breaking a sweat. How he had never once acted like he had something to prove. Darius didn't stay for gratitude. He didn't wait for admiration. He didn't need it. He simply paid for his meal, walked to the door, and disappeared into the night. The sound of his boots on the gravel the last thing anyone heard before the stillness returned. The legend of that night would spread. Stories always do. Some would exaggerate it, some would water it down. But at its core, the truth would remain. A man walked in alone, faced a challenge he never asked for, and walked away unchanged. And in doing so, he changed everything. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the kind of strength that truly matters, share it. Pass it along to someone who might need the reminder. And remember, true power isn't found in how loud you are, but in how you carry yourself when it matters most. Like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories.